I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Ann Petrick, Director of Research at Vistage.
Thank you, and welcome to Debunking the Millennial Mystery, How to Retain and Engage Your Millennial Workforce. In the latest report from Vistage Research, we shared that 65% of small and mid-sized businesses plan to expand their workforce in 2019. In an economy with nearly full employment, this means attracting employees who are currently employed, and this also means there's increased risk of having your employees recruited. As you focus on developing effective acquisition and retention strategies, a key consideration should be the fact that millennials now make up almost half of the U.S. workforce. This growing generation of workers has likely posed new challenges to you as an employer, and data shows that the average tenure of millennials is just 18 months. So why and how should you work to keep millennials around? Well, highly engaged employees are 87% less likely to leave, and research shows that millennials are more engaged at organizations with high levels of purpose and meaning. Today we have Santiago Jaramillo, co-founder and CEO of Amplify, here to break down the myths surrounding this generation, share best practices for fostering purpose, and provide insights for engaging and retaining your millennial workforce. At Amplify, Santiago leads a team that supports organizations, including the NFL Trust, in achieving better business outcomes. He's co-author of the Amazon best-selling book, Agile Engagement, and as a regular speaker at Vistage meetings and at industry events, Santiago enjoys sharing his vision for improving the lives of millions of people by helping them be more engaged at work. Welcome, Santiago. Let's get started.
Thank you for that introduction and setting up the topic so well. We are going to be talking about millennials and how do we retain and engage this important part of our workforce. So let's dive right in. So I am the awkward child there in the yellow with the awful bowl cut, and I had read Robinson Crusoe when I was a little boy, and I became completely obsessed with building my own treehouse. My parents obliged, and this is a Sunday morning in Cali, Colombia, and we were building this treehouse when Dad looks over to me and says, "It's time to get ready to go to church. We should go to every week diagonally across from our house." And I said, "Hey, Dad, any way that we can skip church today, continue building this treehouse? We're just finishing the roof." And Dad is a smart man, and he says, "Go ask Mom." And so I did. Mom is in a great mood, approves the skip, and we continue working this treehouse. And I was really happy until about 30 minutes later when a few gunshots rang out close to our home. And this is when a couple hours later we found out what had happened. The leftist militia groups, the guerrillas, had come into the building, the church building, told everyone that there was a bomb in the building and that they needed to evacuate into 2 trucks. And over 100 people were kidnapped for ransom that day, including friends, church family, and extended family. But we were extremely lucky to not have fallen prey to that day. So my parents decided to adapt. They spoke Spanish and had built an entire life and business in Colombia, and they decided to adapt. The external situation had changed so much in Colombia that they didn't believe anymore that Colombia was the best place for their kids to be raised. And so they took the bold step of moving our family to South Florida. And ever since then, my life has been about this one theme. I'm incredibly passionate about this idea of adaptability. And I believe that adaptability is king in times of change. And boy, do we live in times of change today. It's been said that the pace of change is for the first time ever exceeding the pace of learning. There are so many developments in our world and technology, in our industries and in our markets that it's nearly impossible to keep up with what is happening. And so in that world of change, in that VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, I believe that one of the most important attributes and virtues that we can have as people and as business leaders, and research has continued to prove this time and time and again, is this idea of adaptability. When external things change in our environment, how do we as business leaders and as people react to that change? And instead of resisting that change that we perhaps may not control externally, how do we internally react to that and not see that as a threat, but see that as an incredible opportunity, that instead of resisting the change, being late to the party, we can actually use that change that's happening as a catapult to move us forward in our market and us as people. And I remember one of the hardest parts of adapting to the U.S. Journey for me was the colloquialisms, the idioms, or the sayings. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the like chip off the old block. It's like, what does that mean? And the one that really got me is for about 3 years I said this one incorrectly. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase "in a nutshell." In a nutshell, what I'm saying is this. And I'm not sure if people felt bad for me, didn't understand what I was saying, or just didn't want to correct me. But I said. In a nacho for the first 3 years when I was here. And we don't even eat nachos in Colombia. And I would posit to you that it may be a better saying, right? In a small digestible morsel. I don't know what a nutshell is, but anyway, I digress. So for me, adaptability was key in being able to not just survive, but also thrive in a completely different situation and environment for me. And it's not just me, but technology has changed, right? In 1995, our mothers told us great advice: don't get into strangers' cars, don't meet people from the internet. And just 20 years later, we literally summon strangers from the internet and get into their cars. So the world has changed and technology has changed a big part of it. But it's not just technology that's been changing. It's also the landscape of people at work. When we look at US unemployment dropping from over 10% to less than 4% now in 2019, it's not just that we have a strong economy where there's availability for jobs for those who want it, it's also that attracting talent is significantly harder. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks the average number of days that a company takes to fill an open position, right? This is a company saying we have money to pay, we have an open role, who would like to work here? And that has more than doubled since 2010 to now the highest ever recorded. I believe now in 2019, it's closer to 35 days, which is the longest time that the US Bureau of Labor Statistics has ever recorded in modern US history since they began tracking that measure. And so it is clear to conclude that we are in the most difficult talent attraction economy as business leaders today. It has been the hardest time to find new talent. And it's not just that employees have more work options than ever. It's also that they have different expectations of the work experience. The fundamental reasons for why someone chooses to go to work or chooses to stay in that work have changed in the last 20 years, right? We all remember generations that stayed 20, 30, 40 years in the workplace with simply needing job security, good compensation, and good benefits. And those days are no longer here. Those days are gone. Now, according to Glassdoor data, compensation and benefits are the 7th most important thing in why somebody goes to work somewhere and stays at a job. Work-life balance, business outlook, career opportunities, senior leadership, and their belief in the values of the culture matter more than compensation and benefits to skilled talent today. And so Josh Burson leads Deloitte's human capital consulting practice. And he remarked in a recent event where I had the opportunity to speak with him that, we talk about the war for talent. And he talks about what war for talent? The war for talent is over and talent has won. With employees having more work options than ever and having higher expectations, this is creating issues for business leaders in how to architect an employee experience that delivers not only an economic value proposition to employees, right, compensation and benefits, but also this broad set of non-economic value propositions, things like belief in senior leadership, business outlook, and cultural values. Another piece of this change is a generational mix of our workforce. And I think this is important to note as we talk about millennials, what has happened before and what has happened and how has that set us up for where we're at today with the millennial workforce. I'm not sure if you can think back to 1997 and what job and what organization you might have been, but this is what the U.S. workforce looked like, right? About half baby boomers, about a third Gen Xers, entry-level roles, and the silent generation and greatest generation really thinking about retirement and looking for baby boomers to become the succession planning, the next layer of leaders. And this has totally changed today. Millennials now make up more than 40% of the workforce, Gen Xers about 30%, and boomers seeking to figure out how do we keep this thing going, the business, the profit, and the culture with Gen Xers, with Gen X leaders coming behind them. And the reason why, right, every 20 years, obviously generations exit and new generations enter, but the reason why this is having an undue impact, this specific generational change that we're seeing now, is because it's really affecting turnover and job tenure. According to Pew Research Center, on average, and this was done about 3 years ago, baby boomers stayed an average of 7 years in a job, right? 10 years before that, it was closer to 12. And if you can guess, Generation X, how many Gen Xers, how many years would they stay on average in their job? If you guessed 5, you're right. And how about Millennials? How many years on average would they stay in an organization, in a job? It's 2 years. And sometimes when I speak to live audiences, I hear 2 months or 6 months. And sometimes it does feel that way. Like we have a revolving door in terms of millennial engagement, and no matter what we do, it's still difficult to be able to engage and retain this part of the workforce. And this in the data business is what we call a trend, right? Average job tenure is decreasing as you think about generations. And what's interesting, though, is that millennials hope and aspire to stay at a job for 9 years on average. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. Why do millennials want to and desire and aspire to stay at a job for almost a decade, yet only stay for 2 years? We're going to unpack that a little bit later. But the reason why turnover matters is because as we employ more and more of the younger generations, they stay less and less in their roles. And this is just the reality of doing business today. And this is incredibly expensive. For the average employee, it costs upwards of 150% of their annual salary to replace them. And at first, when I saw this stat, I balked at it and I said, really? And surely for a quota-bearing sales rep, I get there. It's probably even more than 150% when you think about the lost sales, lost revenue, and all that. But then I read a study, and the primary reason why most business leaders don't realize the high costs of turnover in their organization is because it's not easy to find out what those costs are, because the cost of turnover never hit the P&L in a single expense line. The cost of turnover gets spread between recruiting, as we have to continue to increase our recruitment practice and bandwidth to make up for more and more people leaving in their role. We feel the impact of turnover when we have to expand the training and development function to continue to train and develop more new employees. We feel it in customer retention, customer loyalty, customer satisfaction. As employees who have important relationships and tacit institutional knowledge walk out the door, and new teams that are not as versed in that customer's or client's situation come in and begin delivering the service or the product. When we add all that up, the costs of turnover are significant. And so all of this creates pressure and uncertainty for us as business leaders. It becomes difficult to recruit, engage, and retain, especially when other businesses are looking and competing significantly for the same skilled talents that we need to power our business and take advantage of the favorable economic climate in front of most of our businesses today. And so the reason why we're talking about millennial engagement is exactly that stat that was mentioned in the opener. Highly engaged employees are 87% less likely to leave their companies than their disengaged counterparts. In fact, industrial organizational psychologists have come to the conclusion that the very best psychological condition that we can measure in a person or in a team that is the best predictor of people performance and specifically turnover at work is employee engagement. So if we want to get a turnover, we first have to understand that leading indicator, which is employee engagement. If we can move the needle for employee engagement for millennials, we can begin to beat the industry average and retain millennials for 3, 4, 5, and 6 years, significantly beating our competition and our ability to engage and retain millennials. And as they become more and a larger portion of our workforce, this becomes an imperative strategic item. But the challenge for us is that in this new world, back office, transactional, non-strategic HR is no longer up to the task of managing the people function. In this new world where we have to make hard and intentional decisions to create an engaging workplace for our millennials, we are asking HR to be strategic, to be business-minded, to be data-driven, and to be agile. These are many things that HR has not been in the past and that HR is needing to evolve to in the future. And what happens is when we don't equip HR folks to be able to be strategic, business-minded, data-driven, and agile, what we end up with as businesses is Band-Aid HR tech solutions that fail to fix the core performance and engagement issues. Many times we hear that HR leaders create a culture committee, right? Of millennials, and those millennials meet and they meet and they brainstorm ideas for how to better engage millennials, and they land on, well, if only you let us wear jeans on Fridays, we would be more engaged, or if we could do a volunteering initiative, we would be more engaged. Or if we could have a ping pong table at the office, we would be more engaged. If we could have another happy hour, we would be more engaged. And the reality is that for most organizations, it's not a lack of snacks, a lack of branded swag, or a lack of a prettier office, or a lack of dress code changes that are standing in the way of millennials staying longer in an organization and truly being engaged. Right? If a company has a significant mid-manager problem, let's say, right, buying a recognition badge system or buying office snacks is a nice perk and activity to give to our teams, but is not fundamentally addressing the core reason why millennials are not engaged. And thus, we spend time and budget on initiatives that sound good and that make people feel good, but at the end of the day, don't move the needle on business performance, which of course, our ability to engage and retain key talent, especially millennials, is critical to be able to do. And the challenge is that most of us realize that engaging millennials is incredibly important. 85% of us think that, yet only 4% of us believe that we are good at engaging the various generations in the work environment. Right? The promised land is this future where we can make data-driven people decisions about millennials and every other generation that yield business outcomes at the speed of change. And we've already talked about the increasing and accelerating speed of change, but this is where we find out that the annual employee survey and the annual performance review is dead. It's not dying, it's dead. That frequency of equipping ourselves with data to make decisions of once a year is no longer sufficient, right? This frequency of once a year is not sufficient in every other business function. We don't look at customer renewals or sales or cash flow once a year and say, oh, looks pretty good, I'll look at it next year, 12 months from now. No, we measure continually and adapt our strategy in an agile way to meet the needs of today's and tomorrow's most important business priorities. What's interesting is what I mentioned before is at least 40% of millennials see themselves staying at their current organization for a minimum of 9 years. And I believe that part of the explanation for their aspirations to stay for a while, yet staying for only an average of 2 years, is that millennials are the first generation to have such easy access to apply and access and know about and move to other jobs. Right? We can pull up LinkedIn and snag a job and JobVite and Indeed in an app on our phone within 10 seconds and apply to 10 organizations in under an hour. And so that availability of jobs means that mobility is impacting millennials, that they can actually vote with their feet. And if they're disengaged, instead of continuing to be disengaged and stay in an organization, they leave and vote with their feet and go on to the next organization, hoping that they're leaving their existing situation for greener pastures. And so the idea is, how can we be industry leading at Millennial? If we're currently keeping and retaining millennials for 2 years, how can we make that 3 this next year and 4 the following year? How can we save on those incredible costs of turnover for millennials and have consistency in our staffing inside of that generation? But we are starting from a challenge, from a big challenge, where only 30% of millennial employees are engaged. So before we continue, let's define exactly what employee engagement is, what we mean by that, so that we can talk about how do we engage millennial employees. So employee engagement, the easiest way to think about this is 3 words: head, heart, and hands. It's an employee's intellectual and emotional connection with their work and with their company that's then demonstrated by the vigor and energy and commitment that they have to chase after the company vision and goals. The easiest way to get a gut feel for what an engaged employee is think of that person who on a Monday morning comes in and says, boss, I'm ready to go. What are we trying to do this week? And I will go through walls to figure out how to do that. They are on fire for the company, and they internalize the company's direction, vision, and goals and pursue that direction with their full intellect and full emotional strength. And I'd ask you to reflect here on how incredibly valuable an engaged employee is to our company. In my personal experience, I have found that a highly engaged employee who is a cultural champion and a cultural ambassador can many times add not just 10 or 15 or 20% more value and be 10 or 15 or 20% more productive than a disengaged employee. I have found that many times it is a factor of 3, 5, 10x more value added to our organizations through a highly engaged employee. These are truly the people driving our businesses forward, solving the tough problems that we need to solve to be able to deliver a delightful customer experience and be able to have a sustainable and profitable business model in the process as we deliver that customer experience. And I believe I want to clarify, because there's lots of terms thrown out there, and many times they're thrown out fairly loosely in terms of employee happiness and employee satisfaction and morale and culture and employee engagement, right? These are all words and terms that are kind of in this word cloud of like culture, people stuff. But the challenge is that we've been misled for the past 20 years to focus on the wrong thing. For the past 20 years, we've been hearing that what we need to provide is, what we need to strive after is satisfied employees instead of engaged employees. And you can probably think about this. Do you have any satisfied employees in your organization? Folks that are leaning back, they're getting paid really well to not do nearly enough. They're not being challenged. They're not stretched. They're not pursuing the business's goals with vigor and energy. They're just kind of sitting back, stagnant, comfortable. Versus, do you have any of those folks that are not all engaged, that are not leaning in and trying to figure out every single day, how do we move the business's priorities forward? And the challenge is that if you're satisfied, you're asking yourself, am I comfortable? Am I going to stay? I work only enough to meet basic expectations. But if you're engaged, a person asks themselves, how can I drive the business forward? My heart and mind are in it, and I give 115% every day. And Gallup and Bain and company partnered up on a research that they believe settles this issue. Engaged staff is 44% more productive than satisfied staff. That continues to beg the question is, do we want satisfied and happy employees, or do we want truly engaged employees? And of course, as business leaders, minding the business's interests, we think about, well, obviously I want engaged, but I would also challenge you to think about what is best for a person, and a person growing and achieving their potential and becoming a better version of themselves as a person, as a professional. Do we grow when we are comfortable, leaning back and stagnant? Or do we grow and thrive when we have a meaningful goal to pursue with all of our might? We hit adversity and it pulls out of us new capabilities that we didn't even know we had before. And so engagement is not only more profitable for the business, but it's also fundamentally better for the individual. And so we are doing a disservice actually to people and to our businesses when we focus on happiness or satisfaction instead of focusing on the thing that matters, which is employee engagement, which is why we're talking about that specifically today for the millennial generation. And these are the employee engagement drivers. The great thing is we don't have to guess. There's been amazing research done in the last 15 years by industrial organizational psychologists about what actually drives engagement. And as we looked at our data set about millennials and what engages them and what are some of the biggest blockers for millennial engagement today that is causing lower and lower average tenures for millennials, we see three main drivers that are causing those millennial challenges in businesses. A lack of millennials understanding the purpose of the business. And the purpose driver is, does an employee understand why a company and an organization exists? more than making profit, by the way, how it contributes something positive to the world or people or businesses in some way? And do they understand personally how they contribute to that purpose being realized by the organization? That's a big gap today. Millennials don't feel, so it's either companies have not yet articulated and arrived at that core idea of why they exist that's beyond making a profit, or they have landed on that, but it's perhaps a great purpose statement line or mission statement line in an onboarding packet, but it hasn't been activated inside of the organization and marketed back to employees as incredible value of that business. Feedback is another one. I'm not sure if you experience this with your millennial employees, but they are so hungry for feedback. How am I doing? Am I doing well? Am I not? How am I doing in my job? And this, millennials are part of what is killing the annual performance survey. Once a year for feedback, for formal feedback is not sufficient. The expectations of the speed of change, right? Millennials grew in a digitally native world, right? If you've ever seen a 3-year-old with an iPad today, you see how younger generations are born with technology right in front of them. Many times before they can even talk, they can navigate Netflix, right? And get to a specific YouTube video that they enjoy. They are digital natives. And in this world of instantaneous access to everything with our smartphones, their patience for receiving feedback is significant, and the mechanisms and processes and frequencies of how we're giving feedback aren't sufficient today. And then lastly, professional development. Millennials are hungry to upskill, to grow in their skill set, and to grow as professionals. And in general, at least the customers that we work with, we've gathered over 5.2 million unique points of employee feedback, many of those millennials. These are the 3 biggest blockers to that. And so these may not be the blockers for millennials in your organization. That's why it's so important to measure employee engagement and find out for you and for your business specifically, what is holding millennials back. But in general, these are 3 interesting trends, and we're going to talk about a couple of these. Before we move on and get to some of the more practical and pragmatic takeaways from this presentation, I want to explain a little bit about why millennials are seeking different things from their workplace than generations before, right? So a couple thousand years ago, most of human time in a day was spent acquiring food and figuring out where we were going to sleep at night and how to have shelter and be able to just physically survive. Right. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about this concept that you can't talk about, hey, I want to belong in a group, or I want to have high self-esteem from self and others, if you literally can't put dinner in front of your family, that day. And so as we fulfill needs from the bottom of the pyramid, the next generation, or we can strive for the next layer above in the pyramid. And so in general, baby boomers, who generally have raised millennials, created a world in which food and safety and basic belonging was given, and all millennials simply walked into that world. And again, I'm talking stereotypically, generically about an entire generation full of millions of people, right? And then social media came in and made millennials feel part of groups and love and affection and self-esteem based on the amount of likes and friends and people that were on text messages and Snapchats and WhatsApps with. Right, whether that's real self-esteem and real belonging and real friendships is beside the point. Millennials feel this way. And so if all of this, if the first 4 layers have been handed to them, then the next thing that they get to want is self-actualization. I want to achieve my potential. I want to be fulfilled. I want to have meaning, and I expect my work to deliver that to me. And many times I hear from older generations, that's a really unfair ask by millennials. Why do I all of a sudden have to give millennials a sense of meaning and self-actualization and fulfillment, right? Simply paying your paycheck steady was enough. Why isn't that enough? And I believe that going back to adaptability, we have a fork in the road to take when we feel that. We can rage against reality and take too long to adapt, to give this generation what they need, or we can realize that these are simply facts of life, and we have the opportunity to adapt to these facts of life faster than our competition and become exceptional at attracting, engaging, and retaining millennial talent. And so why isn't this working? Why do we believe engagement and millennial engagement is so important, yet so many of us are still struggling with it? And as I was doing research and uncovering the insights that we shared in the Amazon best-selling book, Agile Engagement, we spoke with Patagonia and Netflix and Gore-Tex and amazing companies out there that have great cultures. We found out that there's two shared things that great, highly engaged millennial cultures had, and conversely, two things that highly disengaged cultures did not have. So why isn't this working? Two things. A lack of strategy is the first one. Michael Porter, wrote the seminal paper on Porter's 5 forces. He also wrote the research paper called "What is Strategy?" One of the first early definitions of business strategy. He talks about the essence of strategy is that you must set limits on what you're trying to accomplish. Steve Jobs famously said, "Strategy is not what you say no to; it's about what you say yes to." In fact, when Steve Jobs was fired from Apple as CEO, the company that he started, he later started Next. Next got acquired by Apple, and Steve Jobs became Apple's CEO once again. The very first thing that he did strategically was cut down the Apple product line from over 20 different computers to 3. And he said, we have to be world-class. These 3 devices have to be amazing. And the only way that we create 3 amazing devices if we say no to 19 other ones and focus all of our efforts on 3. And that is an incredibly bold decision to take. It's a risky decision. And most of the time, the best way that we get to clarity and confidence on making such difficult decisions of focus and the incredible trade-offs that come from business strategy is having data that proves that our hypothesis has a good chance of being correct. Peter Drucker talked about the importance of people before it was cool and before it was hip. He's a visionary in terms of talking about the importance of people in a business accomplishing its purpose and succeeding with its business model. And he coined this phrase of what gets measured gets managed. And I don't know about you, but for me, I manage and measure every single part of my business that I can, leading and lagging indicators, from qualified leads, from visitors on the website to qualified leads, to number of sales meetings, to number of customers, to customer value attainment, to customer renewal, to customer referrals, the entire spectrum, to cash, to profit, right? To all the lagging indicators of performance. I have those measured. And for me, and I hear for other business leaders, it's so that we can focus our time and evolve our strategy in a nimble way. And we measure operations and sales and customer service, but how often are we measuring and gathering data about engagement and culture? And many times I hear that we're finding out data about what's broken in our culture and our millennial experience with exit interviews with millennials. And this is way, way too late, right? We've already lost that millennial. So the idea is, how can we capture leading indicator data that helps us know ahead of time if we are going to lose millennials and enables us to have a shot at taking corrective action to be able to keep the skilled, high-performing millennials that we want to keep in our organization. And so measurement becomes the key here. How do we gather data about millennial employee engagement? And there's some best practices. The first is we want to be data-driven. Many times we hear that organizations begin to do kind of start, stop, or keep exercises with their culture. Hey, what could we start, stop, or keep? And they seek a lot of kind of open-ended qualitative answers. In an organization of 3 or 5 or 10 people, that can work well. But as soon as an organization starts to have some more people complexity and more management layers, and you get to 25, 30, 40, 50 people, and certainly above 100 people, we begin to be more removed from it, and the amount of qualitative, open-ended responses that we get becomes too wieldy to sift through and takes too much time and effort to yield the core insights, the 1, 2, or 3 things that we can do in a very focused way that will make the most difference. So the first thing is we want to make sure that we're data-driven, that we are quantitatively measuring employee engagement for millennials and for other generations. The second best practice of measuring and gathering data to inform our millennial retention and engagement strategy is measuring the right thing, which we talked about. Not measuring employee satisfaction or happiness, but measuring specifically employee engagement. A third piece is surfacing reality. And the reason why I put surfacing reality is because many times us as business leaders have a false perception of what reality is. Or perhaps our employees have a perception about the work environment. It may be right or not, but their perception is their reality. And so for us to understand, hey, are we truly a 90th percentile millennial employer, or are we a 10% percentile and we have significant issues? Let's bring that out. Let's get an objective benchmark of where we're at so that we know where we're starting from, and with eyes wide open, understand where our millennials are in our organization. And this is a challenge for us because executive leaders are about 40% more engaged than everyone else in the organization. And if you play out this logic, this becomes really concerning, because many times we're hiring millennials to be on the front lines, to sell the customer, to talk to the customer, to service the client, right? Those frontline folks are the ones delivering the customer experience, yet they're the ones that are the least engaged. And the reason why many leaders have a false perception of how engaged their teams are is because they deal with the most engaged employees in the whole organization every day, senior leadership. So let's continue. The fourth piece is confidentiality. Many times I hear that organizations go online, grab a couple of interesting questions to ask their millennial employees or their employees in general, and they put it inside of a SurveyMonkey form or a Google form and send it out. And the challenge is bad data is worse than no data. If we are asking part of our workforce, which is disengaged, right? We all have disengaged employees. If we're asking disengaged employees who don't believe that leadership has their best interests or that they're not going to do anything with the data, they have a lot more to lose than they have to gain by being honest in a survey. They may fear retribution of being fired if they're actually honest. So they'll either, if you do an internal survey, they'll either lie or simply not take it. And then we're missing an important voice, right, of the people that we most want to hear from. Lastly, if you engage with a employee engagement measurement provider, make sure that they can segment by generation. Of course, we want to be able to see specifically what's disengaging and causing millennial turnover and what is not. Lastly, the frequency once a year is not at all sufficient in today's world. We believe that we've seen that quarterly is the best frequency. It's not too often. It's not weekly or monthly where we have to play a game of whack-a-mole with the latest employee complaint, but it's also significantly more frequent than annual. So quarterly, we already typically have cadences around communicating company strategy and priorities to our teams quarterly, report financial metrics instead of that frequency. And so gathering data and evaluating our strategy quarterly is the frequency that we've found be a best practice. And then lastly, right channel. Right, if any of you have millennial kids or siblings, how well does it work when you fax a millennial? It doesn't work well at all, right? You have to not even call them, you have to text them, or many times we may have to Snapchat them at this point. And so using the right channel is important. We have to have not only email and paper-based ways to measure employee engagement, but also mobile-friendly ways, like in a text message, SMS, or in a mobile app. Those communicating, asking those questions via those more modern communication channels yield significantly more participation from millennials in those surveys. And so we talked about, this is a really practical takeaway of one thing that I believe that any organization employing millennials can wield this tactic to increase the level of purpose, meaning, and fulfillment that millennials have, which is one of the key blockers for their engagement and retention. So let's talk about the return on investment of activating an authentic sense of purpose and meaning in our team. The University of Michigan did this fascinating study. They have an endowment that the university does. And obviously this endowment is used for scholarships for students. And they have an endowment sales team in terms of calling alumni and asking for money and then, raising money for the endowment in that way. And so they split up this team of cold callers dialing for dollars from alumni for the endowment, and they split them up into 4 groups. The A group was a control group. They changed nothing. They changed nothing about their rhythms and process, and they just said, do your usual cold calling work, and they measured the amount of dollars that they raised from alumni. Group B, they read right before those folks started dialing for dollars, they read a letter about the job benefits that the employee got by working here. So, hey, you get tuition assistance, you get paid $15 an hour, if you get this commission for many dollars raised, and you get these health benefits if you work up to this amount. So they just reminded them of the benefits and the perks of this cold calling job, and that was the B group. And what they found, interestingly enough, when they began doing this, is there was no change in performance for the control group or B that were reminded of the benefits and the perks of their job. But in a very fascinating turn of events, for C, they actually read stories to that team before they started cold calling about the life impact that endowment had had. So it was a letter from a recently graduated a first-generation college student that said, if it wasn't for this endowment and the dollars that you raised, I would not be here, and I wouldn't have these life-changing opportunities in front of me. So they read this scholarship story before they began cold calling. And what they saw was a 143% increase in weekly fundraising when compared to the A and the B group. But fascinatingly, the 4th group, they actually brought that first-generation college student in physically, flew that person in to the office, and they heard from that recipient live for 5 minutes, and they shared the same thing. I'm a first-generation college student. This endowment changed my life. Thank you for the work that you do. It's incredibly important in making opportunities for people like me happen through this endowment. And what they saw was a 400% raise in weekly funding. What this is us marketing back to our teams about the positive impact that our organization makes in the world. And the more high fidelity that we can make it, the closer to having a person in front of them. So maybe you might not be able to fly in a client or a customer or whoever was the end recipient of the good that your company does. Perhaps it's a real life video feed, or perhaps it's a recorded video, or at the very least it's a call. And if you can't do that, then an email or a story, right? And the closer that we get to an in-person live interaction, millennials seeing that change, the closer they get to it, the more they'll feel self-actualization, like what they're striving after half their waking life working for your organization actually matters, is actually making a difference. And they'll turn around and the next day do better work, be more productive, and actually enjoy that and better achieve their potential as people. And so regardless of the business, this is a tactic that you can think about. How do we communicate our organization's purpose? And the first question is, what is your organization's purpose? Is it one that talks about the good that it does for someone more than just profit for shareholders? What is that organization's purpose? If you think you have a really great purpose statement of being able to describe your business model and in a purpose statement in a way that changes the world, I'd love for you to put that in the comments of the webinar, or put it as a question afterwards, and I may read out a couple of examples that I think are great examples of purpose statements that are really engaging. But it's not just landing on a great purpose statement. Again, a great purpose statement in an onboarding packet that gets looked at and said once but doesn't get activated is useless. The second question becomes, how could you or someone else in your team tell, or in fact, even better, one of your customers or clients or the recipients of the good, how can we tell an inspiring story about the positive impact that an organization made? And even if we can't articulate how our business directly does good, at the very least, right, most organizations now have a philanthropy arm. At the very least, maybe the business model itself, maybe you can't figure out how to express that in a way that does good for more than just profit. But at the very least, how do we use that profit to help the community? So it could be the recipient of a local school that you did a food drive for, and the impact that had for that organization. It's not ideal, but it's the next best thing. to that. And so in the last few minutes that we have together, I want to share with you a little bit of a case study of a Vistage member in Birmingham, Alabama called T.H. Marine that basically found out that when they looked at a millennial and their generational employees, they had in their production team, they had a really low engagement driver of utilization. And utilization is are people getting to contribute their forced skill set to the company, or they underutilized. And so they didn't know what to do, but they knew the production team was struggling. And in fact, they had 100% turnover in that team. I kid you not. Highly skilled welders, they would lose all of their people in a given year. They would have to rehire and retrain basically every single person in that team every year. So they had a really big turnover problem because of that disengagement and its utilization, but they didn't know what to do. And so they took the second step in the agile engagement methodology, which is try to better understand the problem. And they invited that production team to a focus group type meeting. And they asked them, listen, we care about you. We know that you're struggling with utilization. Here's what utilization means, by the way. What would you do just to change this in the organization? And what they learned from is these highly skilled welders had gone there because they actually loved welding. And these folks were spending most of their day lifting heavy metal sheets from one place to another to get them ready for welding. So they were missing their welding targets, their backs hurt because they weren't trained to do this. And it was just a really inefficient process. So they ask that the next step is focus action. So that production team actually said, you know what? You sought input from us. We're close to the problem. We helped you really narrow it. It's a utilization problem. It's happening in production. And why it's happening is we're unproductive because of a lack of equipment. They took focused action and they chose to implement production's team suggestion. They purchased a forklift and a leveling table so that every day, just once a day, they could grab all those metal sheets, move them over to the leveling table. Leveling table would lift them up, and the materials would be prepped for welding, which significantly cut down the prep time, significantly increased productivity for the team, and of course began to make a dent in their employee engagement. So the fourth step in this methodology of how do we find out what the right best next step is to engage our millennials, right? The first thing is we measure their engagement and we understand the best areas of opportunity. The second step is we qualitatively diagnose and ask those people, those millennials and those teams that are disengaged, their ideas to solve a very specific problem around a specific engagement driver. We have to prioritize and be strategic and focus. Third is to take focus action. And then after we do that, we want to, of course, analyze the results to see if what we did actually generated progress. And if we did, let's celebrate and recognize that. And if it did not, let's iterate that strategy based on lessons learned. This, by the way, is actually the T.H. Marine team on the back. You see Jeff, the Vistage member, general manager, all the way on the right. And you can see part of the millennial staff inside of that production team. And so they measured 90 days later after they took the action, quarterly measurement of engagement. They sought to find out, did this forklift and leveling table, the $60,000 investment, did it make a difference or not? And here's what they found. Engagement improved 8 points. That production team went from the lowest engaged group in the entire company to the second most highly engaged group, only second to senior leadership. Number two, productivity went up 30%. And I don't know about you, but for us, productivity across the board is hard to measure. For manufacturing, it's not. With the same crew, how many boat parts do they produce at the end of the day? And they shared a 30% increase in productivity. And I asked, well, what does that really mean? Well, they increased production capacity by $3.8 million, which meant that they can now produce 3.8 million more boat parts per year. And at a 10% profit margin, right, it's $380,000 to the bottom line for a $60,000 investment. I have to share with you, that's my favorite part about what we get to do at Amplify and what we get to do with employee engagement, is that these decisions that we can take for millennials and for other generations in our workplace not only benefit the business and help us improve business performance and ultimately grow faster and make more profit, they also benefit the people and the individuals We get to live out a better leadership legacy. We get to be better stewards of people's time who are giving half their waking life to our cause every single day, and we get to make a very real difference in people's lives. And so this is the opportunity in front of us. We can choose to adapt what we are doing, the employee experience that we're putting forth for all the generations, specifically the millennial workforce, to meet the needs that they're expressing they need to stay at their job closer to the 9 years that they aspire to rather than the 2 years that they actually stay today. But to do that, we have to be open to adapting how we do business in a smart way and how we make the right actions forward without hurting our business and without running it irresponsibly. Is we have to be very strategic and data driven about the right next steps that we take to evolve our employee experience to deliver what millennials need to do their best work and stay with us. And you can follow 4 steps: measuring employee engagement, qualitatively diagnosing the root cause, taking focused action, and analyzing results. And if nothing else, what we can all do is we can think about how do we bring inspiring stories of client, customer, stakeholder life change that's been caused by the business doing its daily work. If we can do that, we can begin to aspire to engage and retain millennials in greater proportions that our competition can't, and culture eats strategy for breakfast. We have the opportunity of continue dominating our markets by being the very best millennial engaging environment that we can. So I'm excited to hear about your questions inside of the question box as we end. I hope this has been valuable for you today and inspired in you a few ideas, or at the very least a renewed commitment of gathering data to improve millennial employee engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Santiago. That was such a great mix of why and how engagement is important, as well as the risks and opportunities, depending on how you take action around engagement. So I did have one question that came through earlier in the presentation, and it tied to the idea that perks actually don't equal engagement. One of the attendees has NPS scores that are in the middle from the minority of the team, and their feedback items are surface level suggestions, kind of like you discussed, jeans, snacks, and small perks that don't seem very substantial. So what do you think about those small pieces? Are they saying something just to say it?
Sure. It's many times the quality of the answers we get are in direct proportion to the quality of the questions that we ask. And so if we had at first experimented at Amplify, just asking like, hey, an open-ended to everybody, what could we improve about our culture? And literally got, well, if we had better coffee creamer in the office, I wouldn't be so upset every morning. Or, hey, if you moved the office location closer to my house, I would be more engaged, the culture would be better. And the reality is that we are getting the same quality of answers as we are being thoughtful about the questions. And so instead of sharing open-ended ones, what we've seen significantly folks have much more success with is asking a quantitative set of questions that give you a quantitative measurement of engagement. And then once you prioritize an area that you're committed to taking action on, then ask a very specific question about that area to people, and they'll come up with really, really great. The reality is many times as humans, we're not industrial organizational psychologists about ourselves, right? It's hard to have objectivity and truly understand what exactly drives culture and what exactly drives our and others' employee engagement, right? That is not necessarily a shared knowledge that exists today in most people. And so when we ask generic open-ended questions that are not very good, we get the same quality of answers. But if we can be very thoughtful about the questions that we ask, or better yet, partner with a third-party measurement provider like Amplify or like somebody else to help generate those data points, then that can yield an action suggestions that are significantly better. And I also challenge something in there as well, if I may, which is using NPS as a measure of culture and people. So while NPS is a helpful tool on the customer side, I believe that it's been misapplied to the employee group. And while it can be interesting for us to think about, well, we want to be consistent. We've got customer NPS, and so we also have to have employee NPS. The problem with NPS is that the question is asked is, would you recommend this job to your friends and family, right? That's the MPS question. The problem with that is it's really measuring satisfaction. If you think deeply about it, if you're getting paid a lot to do not very little, and you're comfortable and you're stagnant and you're getting to run 2 different businesses during your work because you have such little work, because you're satisfied and leaning back, who wouldn't recommend that job to friends and family, right? And so I think NPS is actually a good measure of satisfaction, and not a good measure of employee engagement. I think when we begin to measure the wrong thing, that's when we begin chasing our tails with little perks and little changes that don't fundamentally address the core reasons for why people are not engaged at work, and why they're not staying in their role for longer than the industry average.
Great, thank you. Yeah, as you were talking about that, I thought NPS, that's actually satisfaction versus engagement. So speaking of measuring engagement, you talked about quarterly quantitative surveys. I assume that they're really measuring engagement drivers. So can you tell us a little about the employee experience for the quarterly surveys? What are the questions that are asked in the qualitative survey or in the quantitative surveys? And then what's that qualitative experience like?
Sure. So obviously there's different ways to do quantitative surveys. I can only speak to how we do them at Amplify. So I'll share that is what we do is we share a 6-minute survey with employees in a company, and it's shared via text message, via email, and via mobile app. And so between that, we get more than 80% participation of our customers' employees, and they fill out Likert questions, so strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so it's statements like, I have all the tools that I need, at work to be able to succeed, or I understand what the purpose of the business is past making a profit, or I receive adequate and frequent feedback about how well I'm doing in my job. And so it's easy multiple choice, right? Do I strongly agree with that statement, or do I strongly disagree? And that's a rigorous way to capture quantitative data. And so once we capture that, we're able to put a very clear heat map in front of a leader that says, here are the 14 drivers of engagement, and here are your employee segments. You can see them by generation or by team or by location. And the customer then picks a specific area. So, utilization for the sales team, or purpose for millennial generation. And then the qualitative question is extremely easy. It's what would you, group, millennial group or sales group. So what would you millennials, what would you start, stop, or keep doing to improve, sense of purpose in the sales team, right? Just kind of, let's say we focus for sense of purpose on the sales team. And that's it. That's the qualitative question. But the importance is that we've already narrowed down a specific group we're asking about, a specific engagement problem that we're asking about. And that methodology of starting with quantitative to pick out an area and then go deep for root cause analysis and action and idea generation with qualitative is the methodology that we found works best to generate true actionable insight. Because pretty graphs and data with employee, we can get that. But if we can't get to action, 1, 2, or 3 very clear actions that we can take to improve engagement, then I believe that our data gathering efforts and our closed loop feedback system have failed. So we have to be able to get to that actionable insight that leads to quick and frequent action.
Fascinating. I have 1,000 more questions, but unfortunately we need to wrap up. So I want to thank you, Santiago, and remind everyone that the deck is available as a PDF for download in the handout section, and the recording will be made available to you next week. Speaking of next week, join me next Friday, March 15th, for the Next Fridays with Vistage webinar that will delve into the findings of our latest report, CEO Projections for 2019. Chief Research Officer Joe Galvin and a panel of experts, including Kathleen Quinn-Votaw from Talent Trust and Mark Emmer from Optimize Inc., as well as myself, will all discuss the key decisions facing CEOs in 2019 and the strategies to address these top priorities, including hiring, expansion, and productivity. So be sure to register for that session by logging on to vistage.com/FWV. That's vistage.com/FWV. Thank you, Santiago, and for everyone who attended today, have an excellent afternoon.